Royalty, a world draped in velvet and gold, but beneath the surface lies a darker tale. For centuries, the fate of empires was sealed not by battle, but by marriage, and some of the most shocking unions involved the most vulnerable, teenagers. Children barely old enough to write their names were wed to strangers. Some were pawns, others became powerhouses, and a few met devastating ends. This is the story of 6 royal marriages that stunned their courts, changed kingdoms, and left a legacy of betrayal, ambition, and tragedy. From England to Egypt, France to Scotland, these aren't fairy tales. These are survival stories in crowns. If stories of power, betrayal, and royal destiny intrigue you, be sure to like the video, subscribe for more untold history, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Every crown has a story, and we'd love to hear what you think. 1. Catherine of Aragon, the teen bride and the curse of England. She was 15, a girl still brushing the edges of childhood, sent across the stormy sea to become a wife. But not just any wife, the bride of the future King of England. Her name was Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of Spain's Catholic Majesties, Ferdinand and Isabella. A princess raised on empire and religion. She spoke Latin better than many bishops, and believed, as all the world did, that her life was blessed by God. But God had other plans. Waiting for her in England was Arthur Tudor, the crown prince. Just 15 as well, but already a fragile shadow of a boy, pale and awkward. They were children, both of them, but no one cared. Their marriage was a political masterstroke, an alliance between England and Spain, sealed not with treaties, but with teenagers. On November 14th, 1501, they were wed at St. Paul's Cathedral. Thousands watched as Catherine, draped in gold and Spanish lace, stood beside a boy she barely knew. They bowed, they smiled, they were paraded like trophies. But behind the smiles was fear, and something far worse, ignorance. They were sent away almost immediately to Ludlow Castle, alone. No mothers, no advisors. 2 adolescents suddenly expected to behave like monarchs and like husband and wife. And then, sickness. Within months, both fell gravely ill, sweating, vomiting, coughing blood. Whatever struck Ludlow that winter showed no mercy. By April 1502, Arthur was dead, just 16, and Catherine, now a teenage widow in a foreign land, was plunged into darkness. The wedding had lasted barely 5 months. Her position collapsed overnight. She was no longer the princess bride. She was the Spanish girl with no husband, no dowry, and no purpose. And here the real drama began, because the question on everyone's lips was not how Arthur died, but whether they had ever truly been married. Did they consummate the union? If they had, Catherine could never marry his younger brother. If they had not, the game was still in play. Catherine claimed no, the marriage had never been physically completed. She was, in the eyes of God, still untouched. It was a desperate claim, a dangerous one, but it worked. She remained in England for 7 humiliating years, half prisoner, half guest, living on scraps from the crown, her youth fading, her future uncertain. But then came Henry, Arthur's younger brother. He was 18, she was 23, a 5-year gap now, reversed. And this time, they married for real. And for a time, they were happy. But as the years passed and no male heir came, the question Catherine thought she'd buried the night in Ludlow returned with a vengeance. That one teenage marriage, that one uncertain night, would ignite the fire that tore England from the Catholic Church, fractured Europe, and redefined monarchy forever. And it began with a sickly boy, a lonely girl, and a wedding that should never have happened. 2. Mary, Queen of Scots, a crowned child and a sickly king. She was 6 days old when her father died, and with his final breath, Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland, a crown so heavy it nearly crushed her before she could walk. At 5, she was sent to France, not for safety, but for strategy. She would be raised at court and molded into a bride for the future king, a political instrument in silk slippers. Her groom was Francis, the Dauphin of France, a boy just 1 year her junior, delicate, timid, and constantly ill. Together, they were 2 royal children locked in a gilded cage, trained to smile, to bow, to serve an empire's ambition. In 1558, at just 15 years old, Mary was married to Francis in a grand ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. She wore white satin embroidered with silver, dazzling, radiant, ethereal. The crowd gasped. She looked like an angel. But this was no fairy tale. Francis was painfully shy, his body stunted by illness, and he recoiled from attention. Mary, by contrast, was tall, intelligent, and politically astute, a foreign queen in a court that whispered about her behind painted fans. Their union wasn't based on love. It was a transaction. Mary brought with her a claim, a dangerous one, to the English throne through her Tudor bloodline. This made her not just the Queen of Scots, but a Catholic threat to Elizabeth I of England. And when Mary Tudor died, and Elizabeth ascended the English throne, Mary's marriage to the French heir became an immediate geopolitical threat. Then, just 1 year after the wedding, King Henry II of France died in a freak jousting accident. A lance splintered through his eye. Blood soaked the linen of the Renaissance court. Francis II, barely 15, became king, and so did Mary, Queen of France, Queen of Scotland, and possibly a future Queen of England. For a moment, she held 3 crowns, and the world held its breath. But Francis, always sickly, did not last long. His reign lasted barely 17 months. He died of an ear infection, or perhaps a brain abscess, in excruciating pain, his face swollen, his breathing ragged. He died in Mary's arms. She was 17 years old, a widow, a double queen, alone. The French court turned cold overnight. Catherine de' Medici, Francis's mother, took control. Mary, now politically inconvenient, was cast aside. She returned to Scotland, a land she barely remembered, to rule a kingdom divided by religion, greed, and treachery. And from there, her life would spiral into betrayal, murder, scandal, and a long, slow path to the executioner's block in England. But it all began here. 2 teenagers in a marble palace, dressed like royalty, but used like pawns. A marriage that crowned her queen of 2 nations and cursed her forever. 3. Isabella of Valois, the child bride and the king on the brink. In a century of war and plague, peace was a fragile thing. And sometimes, peace wore the face of a child. In 1396, at the height of the 100 Years' War, England and France struck a truce. But treaties were not enough. To make it binding, they needed something more, something public, something symbolic. So they reached for a girl. Her name was Isabella of Valois, daughter of King Charles VI of France, a princess of royal blood, noble bearing, and innocent eyes. But she was just 6 years old. Her groom? King Richard II of England. He was 29, a widower, a king under pressure, tormented by political enemies, and haunted by the ghost of his dead wife, Anne of Bohemia. He was desperate, not for love, but for legitimacy. His throne was wobbling, his enemies were circling, and a new French alliance could buy him the breathing room he needed. But at what cost? The marriage caused uproar. Even in an age where royal unions were more political than personal, a 23-year age gap between a fully grown man and a child barely past infancy stunned the nobility and revolted the commons. Yet the wedding went ahead, a lavish spectacle at Calais, where little Isabella, in a white and gold gown, was presented to her future husband like a peace offering. According to chroniclers, Richard tried to comfort the terrified girl, telling her, You are my wife now, and I will be good to you." He promised not to share her bed until she was older, a vow both gallant and deeply disturbing in context. He brought her to England and gave her dolls, jewels, a household of nurses and governesses. But it was not love, it was propaganda. A child queen for a fractured kingdom. For a brief moment it worked. The people were charmed by the little French princess, the court softened, but it was only an illusion. 2 years later, Richard left her behind to face rebellion. Henry Bolingbroke, exiled and embittered, returned with an army and seized the throne. Richard was deposed, imprisoned, and likely murdered in secret. Isabella, now just 8 years old, was suddenly no queen at all. Alone, powerless, and widowed before she reached puberty, she was kept in England under watch. France demanded her return. England resisted. When she was finally sent home, it was as a political afterthought, not a queen, not a widow, just a discarded piece in a brutal game. Years later, she married again, this time by choice, to Charles, Duke of Orléans. But she died at just 19, her life a blur of crowns, tears, and captivity. Her story is rarely told, but it should be, because in the name of peace, a kingdom gave away a child to a man whose own crown was crumbling. And in doing so, they revealed the ugliest truth of medieval royalty. Peace never comes without a price. And sometimes the price is a little girl in a golden dress. For Margaret Beaufort, the girl who bled for a dynasty, she would become the mother of kings, the architect of a dynasty, the silent power behind the throne. But first, she was just a child. Margaret Beaufort was born into a dangerous world. England, 1443, a nation bleeding from the Wars of the Roses. Royal bloodlines twisted like a thicket of thorns, and every noble girl was a pawn on the chessboard of ambition. At just 12 years old, Margaret Beaufort, only daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and a direct descendant of John of Gaunt, was married off in a political arrangement that would shape English history. Her groom was Edmund Tudor, a man in his mid-20s, experienced, calculating, and already maneuvering through the shifting alliances of the Wars of the Roses. Edmund was no ordinary nobleman. He was the son of Queen Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, making him the half-brother of King Henry VI. Though born of a love match between a dowager queen and a Welsh courtier, Edmund had climbed the ranks of power quickly. And now, with the crown in jeopardy, he was eager to secure a male heir who might one day stake a claim to the throne. There was no courtship, no innocence, no chance to grow up. At 12, Margaret was still small and slender, her body not yet ready to bear children, but that didn't matter. What mattered was dynasty. By the time she turned 13, she was pregnant. 13. The pregnancy was brutal. Historical records suggest Margaret nearly died in childbirth. Some said she could barely walk. Others wrote that her voice grew hoarse from the pain. But in the cold dawn of January 28, 1457, in the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, she gave birth to a boy, Henry Tudor, her only child. The boy she would spend her life protecting, the boy who would one day become King Henry VII and start the Tudor dynasty. But Margaret's survival came at a devastating cost. The birth left her permanently damaged. She would never bear another child. Her body, broken by political ambition, was still a child's body, asked to do a woman's work too soon. And if that weren't enough, Edmund died before the birth, likely of plague in a Welsh prison. Margaret, now a mother at 13, was also a widow. But this fragile girl became a force of steel. She was clever, devout, and ruthlessly strategic. Over the next decades, she would marry twice more, but always on her terms. She never again risked childbirth. Instead, she forged alliances, raised armies, and kept her son's claim to the throne alive from exile. And when the final battle came, Bosworth, 1485, it was Margaret Beaufort's son who triumphed. Her boy, her pain, her purpose. She stood in the shadows of power, yet controlled it all. She founded colleges. She funded translations of religious texts, and she signed her letters, not as a noblewoman, not as a widow, but as Margaret R., the king's mother. But behind that signature was a girl who had once screamed through the night in a stone tower, bearing the weight of England's future in her tiny frame. Her triumph was hard won and soaked in blood. Margaret Beaufort was not just the mother of a king. She was the girl who bled to make him one. 5. Marie Antoinette, a teen bride in a golden cage. She was 14, a girl raised among glittering chandeliers and etiquette so strict it felt like performance art. He was 15, a shy, awkward boy, more comfortable with locks and books than with people. Together, they were the future of France. In 1770, Marie Antoinette of Austria was sent to Versailles to marry the Dauphin of France, Louis Auguste, grandson of King Louis XIV. It was a marriage meant to unite two ancient enemies, Austria and France, through silk ceremony and the clasp of youthful hands. But beneath the powdered wigs and embroidered smiles was a disaster waiting to unfold. Marie had grown up in the imperial palace of Schönbrunn, surrounded by sisters, music, and the sharp mind of her formidable mother, Empress Maria Theresa. But Versailles was different, cold, watchful, and utterly alien. The wedding took place before they had even met. The moment she stepped across the French border, her clothes, servants, language, even her dog, were taken from her. She was stripped of her Austrian identity and remade as the Dauphine of France. But Louis Auguste wasn't ready. Socially withdrawn, awkward in conversation, and likely suffering from a physical condition that made consummation difficult, he was a boy trying to fill a man's shoes, and failing. For 7 years their marriage remained unconsummated. The court whispered, the pamphlets mocked. Marie, now a teenage queen in waiting, was painted as frivolous, cold, even unfaithful, though she was little more than a lonely girl trapped in a golden prison. The ridicule grew. They called her l'Autrichienne, the foreign woman. Some made it crueler, a pun for bitch. And then, in 1774, Louis XV died. At just 19 and 20 years old, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette became King and Queen of France. Children on a collapsing throne, Marie, starved of affection, sought distraction, balls, dresses, elaborate hairstyles that defied gravity. The court's resentment grew. Let them eat cake, they claimed she said, a phrase she never uttered, but one that sealed her fate in the public imagination. As France slid into debt and famine, the people began to turn. The lavish spending, the parties, the diamond necklace scandal all became symbols of a monarchy out of touch with its people. And through it all, the girl who had arrived at 14 remained trapped, not by stone walls, but by image, myth, and suspicion. Revolution came swiftly. The Bastille fell. The monarchy crumbled. In 1793, Marie Antoinette, now 37, walked to the guillotine in a plain white dress. No jewels, no powdered hair, just the ghost of that 14-year-old girl who had once crossed the border and never truly returned. Her teenage marriage was meant to secure peace. Instead, it helped light the fuse of revolution. She came to France as a bride and left as a warning. And Louis Auguste, her shy, reluctant husband, by then King Louis XVI, met the same fate. 9 months before her, he too was led to the scaffold, tried for treason, and executed before a silent crowd. The crown they once wore as children had become too heavy for the world they inherited. 6. Cleopatra, the teenage queen, and her husband-brother. Egypt has always conjured images of gods and gold, but behind the grandeur of the Nile was a brutal truth. Royalty here came with daggers, poison, and sibling marriage, and no one embodied that world more fiercely than Cleopatra VII. She was just 18 years old when she became Queen of Egypt. But she wasn't alone on the throne. Her father's will decreed she marry her brother, Ptolemy XIII, a 10-year-old boy. Yes, you heard that right. An 18-year-old woman married to her 10-year-old brother. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about tradition. It was about dynasty. For centuries, Egypt's Ptolemaic rulers descended from Alexander the Great's general, married within the family to preserve pure blood. But in practice, it bred only jealousy, madness, and civil war. Cleopatra had no intention of being ruled by a child. From the moment she donned the crown, she made it clear she would not share power. She put her own face on coins. She issued decrees in her own name. She even refused to speak Greek alone, mastering Egyptian, something no ruler in her dynasty had done. But behind her, lurking in the marble corridors of Alexandria's royal palace, were Ptolemy's advisors, ruthless men who saw Cleopatra as a threat. They whispered poison in the boy king's ear, stoking fear and division. The court split, the marriage fractured, and the throne began to shake. In 49 BCE, Cleopatra was forced to flee. She disguised herself, crossed the desert, and raised an army, ready to return not as a queen, but as a conqueror. Meanwhile, her young brother's court waited smugly in the palace. They underestimated her. Everyone did, until Julius Caesar arrived. Cleopatra did not walk into Caesar's tent. She rolled herself in a rug and had it smuggled into his chambers, dramatically unrolled before him like a gift. A calculated act of brilliance and seduction. The moment changed history. Caesar backed Cleopatra. War erupted between brother and sister. Ptolemy's army clashed with Caesar's in the streets of Alexandria. The Nile ran red, and in the end, Ptolemy XIII, still only 15, was drowned while trying to flee. Cleopatra returned to the throne, this time with no one to share it. She ruled Egypt alone, and later with her son by Caesar, and then with Mark Antony. Her name would echo through history as a symbol of power, intelligence, and sensuality. But it all began with a teenage queen, a child husband, and a court that tried to silence her. Cleopatra wasn't born a legend. She became one when she defied a dynasty that demanded obedience, and instead took the throne with blood, strategy, and a rolled-up rug. To wrap it all together, history isn't always grand halls and golden crowns. Sometimes it's a girl too young to understand marriage, a boy king trembling on a throne, or a child bride shipped across seas to secure a fragile peace. These were not fairy tales. They were real lives, twisted by politics, shattered by war, and immortalized by the ink of history. And though centuries have passed, their stories still speak, of power gained too young, of love never given a chance, and of voices lost behind the throne. If you were moved by these forgotten faces of royalty, help us keep their memory alive. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more untold royal stories, and let us know in the comments which of these marriages shocked you the most. And why? Because behind every crown, there's a cost, and history remembers those who dare to look closer.